Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 18. Stop the cab. Agnes yelled out to the driver. She wanted to take a better look. I can't stop here, said the driver, looking in his reversing mirror. There was a line of traffic behind him. You have to stop. Please, just stop. By now Agnes was kneeling on the back seat, frantically searching for where she had last seen the body in the water. The taxi driver switched on his warning lights and pulled over. Agnes leapt out of the cab and ran back along the bridge, ducking up and down trying to see through the railings. In the meantime, the taxi continued across the bridge and parked on the other side. The driver then hurried back to find his passenger. He still had no idea what had happened, but from her action she must have seen something important. By the time he caught up with her, she was punching in a number on her mobile phone. What happened? Are you okay? He asked. She nodded, but didn't have time to say any more as she heard Alan's voice on the other end of the phone. Alan, you have got to get down to the swing bridge right now. She glanced down at the water. I can see a body in the Tyne, she added, before he could interrupt. The chief inspector told her he would be there right away. By now the taxi driver was gazing down at the swirling water. Where is it? I don't see anything. It's there by the joist, support, or whatever it is they are called. Agnes pointed to where she had seen the body. The police are on their way. For a moment the driver couldn't see anything, but then the body suddenly reappeared. Yes, I see something now. Asterisk. Back at the police station, Alan quickly told his sergeant the reason for Agnes's call. I'm going down to the swing bridge right now. Organize some officers and divers and meet me there as soon as possible. We might just have found our second murder victim. Asterisk. The chief inspector opened the door and leapt out of the car before his driver had brought the vehicle to a stop. He saw Agnes and hurried towards her. She was still standing on the bridge, staring down at the water as though keeping guard over the body. It's there. Agnes pointed down toward the massive supports. It keeps disappearing under the water. Perhaps something is dragging it down. Thank you, Agnes. Alan looked at the young, neatly dressed Asian man standing next her. Who's this? This is my taxi driver. I hired him in his cab to take me around the sights of Newcastle. Nice to meet you. The driver smiled and held out his hand. Call me Ben. Hello, Alan smiled as he shook his hand. I am Chief Inspector Johnson. He turned back to Agnes. I'll take it from here. Go and see the sights, he urged, though he knew he was on a losing wicket. Are you mad? Retorted Agnes. There was no way she was going to leave the scene. I discovered the body. I am a witness at the scene where a body has been found. Do you honestly believe I am simply going to walk away to look at the sights? Alan shook his head before turning his attention to the taxi driver. I'm with the lady, said Ben, before Alan could say a word. He grinned. This is turning out to be quite a day. By now, Andrews had arrived with other police officers and divers. Alan barked out a few orders. Keep the traffic moving steadily across the bridge. We don't want traffic backed all the way along the quayside. And keep the people away from the edge of the quay. We can't have anyone falling in the river while trying to take a selfie. He turned to his sergeant and nodded. See that it's done. Once everything was under control, Alan led Agnes and Ben to the quay and told the divers to go ahead. Now it was up to them to bring the body aground. Where's your taxi? Alan asked the driver. Ben pointed across the bridge. I parked it on the other side once I let the lady out. Please call me Agnes, she said, smiling at Ben. She looked back at Alan and explained how she had ordered him to stop the car when she thought she saw something in the river. Obviously, he couldn't stay sitting on the bridge as the traffic was beginning to pile up. But then a thought crossed her mind. Alan, you don't think Ben will get a ticket, do you? Is there a note or something you could give him so he won't be issued with a penalty? See that a police message is placed on the taxi, Alan called out to one of the officers. Shortly afterwards, the body of a man was lifted onto the quayside. The pathologist, who had now arrived at the scene, was able to tell the chief inspector that the body had been in the water for a few days. A cord, attached to the waist of the victim, indicated he had been fastened to something, probably a weight to keep the body submerged. However, the cord was frayed. It must have rubbed against something underwater, causing it to break. Good thing it did, the pathologist concluded. Otherwise he could have Been down there for a very long time. That's most likely what the murderer was hoping for, Alan mumbled. Is there anything else you can tell me before you take the body back to the lab? Only that the poor man was shot. The pathologist pointed to a gunshot. Wound in the head. He would have died instantly. Agnes took a step back. The moment when she and Alan found the body of the woman on the pavement flashed before her. Back then, it had been dark. She hadn't seen the gunshot wound very clearly. Today, despite the clouds overhead, it was still quite bright. Though the wound had been washed by the water in the river, it still looked frightful. But apart from that, the man's eyes were wide open and seemed to be staring up at her. Was this man, even in death, trying to tell her something? Then something in her mind clicked. She had seen this man before, but where? Agnes closed her eyes. Think, woman, she thought. Think back to where you have been over the last few days. When Alan saw Agnes standing with her eyes closed, he thought she was suffering from shock at seeing the dead man lying on the pavement. I think you should go back to the hotel and relax, he said. No, Alan, you don't understand. I've seen this man before, but I can't remember where. Alan glanced at the body. Is it possible you saw him with Mary Swinburne at the hotel? Agnes shook her head. No. The only time I saw Mary Swinburne was at breakfast one morning, and she was alone. What about you? Alan said, looking at Ben. Do you recall ever seeing this man in the back of your taxi? Ben stared down at the victim. Something was stirring in his memory. No, not in my taxi, but I do remember seeing him in a restaurant one evening. It was a few days ago. He nodded towards the restaurant across the road. My wife and I were having a meal to celebrate her birthday, he explained. I recall this. Man had an argument with one of the other diners. It got quite vocal and the manager came to ask him to tone it down a little. Agnes looked across the road towards the restaurant. That's it, she said. That's where I saw him. She turned back to Alan. I was with you, but you had your back to him so you wouldn't have noticed him. He wasn't causing a fuss or anything. He was alone, though another man came over to his table and had a few words with him. She screwed up her eyes as she recalled the evening. The victim was wearing a navy blue suit, white shirt, and blue tie. Alan raised his eyebrows. Agnes shrugged. So, I like to people watch. Alan took a photograph of the victim on his phone. Once the restaurant opened, he would speak to the manager. Maybe he could tell him something about the man. At the moment, no one knew who he was. Any identity he might have been carrying on the night of the murder had been removed from his body before it was dumped into the river. When the pathologist had done all he could at the scene, the body was lifted into a large van and taken back for a post-mortem. There's nothing more you can do here, Agnes. Why don't you continue on your trip around the city? But don't you need me back at the station? Surely I need to make a statement or something. Agnes was determined she was not going to be shuttled off. If she hadn't spotted the body, it might have slipped back into the water, never to be seen again. Alan knew that if it had been anyone else, he would have insisted on them making a statement. Nevertheless, he was doing his best to keep Agnes out of the proceedings for her own sake, though he had to admit it was becoming increasingly difficult as she seemed to be finding all the evidence. Yes, you're right, he conceded. I'll give you a lift back to the station. Agnes turned to Ben and opened her bag. Perhaps I could do the tour thing tomorrow morning. She pointed to the other end of the quay. I'm staying at the Millennium. Could you pick me up outside the hotel at about 10:30? She pulled £30 from her wallet. Will that cover it for today? Ben waved the money aside. No charge, he said. It's been quite an experience. He smiled. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Agnes insisted he should take the money before watching him disappear back over the bridge. Finally, she turned her attention back to Alan. Okay, let's go, she said. Where are you parked? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Once the formalities at the police station were over and done with, Alan asked Andrews to check what time the restaurant opened. It won't open until 5 o'clock, but the manager is there now, Andrews said, putting his hand over the mouthpiece. He is expecting some sort of delivery in the next hour. Fine, tell him I am on my way. He looked at Agnes, still sitting in front of his desk. I can drop you off on the way down there. Agnes didn't say anything until they were out of the station. What's all this about dropping me off? I'm coming with you. Alan opened his mouth to say something, but changed his mind. What was the point? He knew she would go to the restaurant with or without him. At least, with him there, he knew she was safe. Now let me do the talking, Alan said as he pulled up outside. Okay, Agnes said, opening the car door. She walked across to the entrance of the restaurant. I'll just stand there smiling sweetly. The manager appeared at the door, making it impossible for Alan to comment further. Good afternoon, said the manager holding out his hand. My name is Gordon Peterson. How can I help you? Good afternoon, I am Chief Inspector Johnson. He shook hands with Peterson. And this is... Peterson gestured towards Agnes. This is Mrs. Lockwood. Alan coughed. She is assisting us with our inquiries. He paused for a moment. I don't know whether you have heard, but a body was pulled out of the river earlier today, over there by the swing bridge. Yes, I heard something about it on the radio. But what has that to do with me? We hoped you might be able to help us identify the body. It seems the victim used this restaurant a couple of times recently. The chief inspector pulled out his mobile phone and showed the manager the photo he had taken earlier. Do you recognize him? Alan was alarmed when Peterson suddenly turned pale and collapsed into a nearby chair. He hadn't expected such a reaction. Yes, I know this man, Peterson said after a long pause. His name is Dennis Drummond. There was a gasp from Agnes when she heard the name. She placed her hand on the back of one of the chairs to steady herself. Was it possible Dennis Drummond was related to David Drummond, the man who had been stalking her? Would you like to sit down, Agnes? Alan said, as he pulled out a chair from one of the tables. Can I get either of you a glass of water? You can get me a brandy. Peterson uttered. He pointed towards the bar as he sat down. Make it a large one, and have one yourself. I'll see to it, Agnes said, as she made her way over to the bar. She certainly needed one. I take it from your reaction, Mr. Peterson, that you knew Dennis Drummond quite well. Alan said, he was my cousin. We played together when we were kids. He came here for a meal most evenings. He looked up. Who did this? Why? That's what we want to find out. Alan replied. Was he married? Would you like a brandy, Chief Inspector? Agnes held up the bottle. Alan shook his head. Not on duty. Dennis was divorced a little while ago, Peterson replied. He spoke quietly. I don't think he ever got over it. He still loved Dorothy. I'll need to contact her. He paused when Agnes handed him the brandy. Thank you. Did he have any siblings? Alan felt he needed to ask, though he was sure he knew the answer. Yes. Peterson took a drink from the glass. An older brother. His name is David. He lives in London, but he's here in Newcastle at the moment on business. He's staying at the Millennium. The chief inspector glanced at Agnes. By now she was sitting in a chair, alongside Peterson. She took a large drink from her glass of brandy. Someone told the police that Dennis Drummond was arguing with another diner in this restaurant recently, Alan continued. They said you stepped into. Stop it getting out of control. Do you know who he was arguing with? Yes, it was his brother, David. It wasn't really an argument, just a difference of opinion. They were. The manager stopped speaking when a sudden thought popped into his head. You're not suggesting David had anything to do with his brother's murder, are you? Let me tell you, David is not like that. He wouldn't kill his brother. He wouldn't kill anyone. Our inquiries are wide open at the moment, Mr. Peterson. You must understand we are groping around in the dark here. If you know anything that you think will help us find the killer, then please tell me. Alan paused, allowing his last statement to sink in. Now, do you know what the difference of opinion was all about? The manager took another drink from his glass before looking away. You must try to help the chief inspector, Agnes intervened. She had noticed Alan was beginning to look a little frustrated at Mr. Peterson's reluctance to answer his question. It was I who spotted your cousin's body in the river this morning and called the police. I'm doing everything I possibly can to help the police to find out who did this dreadful thing, even though it is none of my business. But you are related to Dennis Drummond. He is your cousin, someone you know and love. You should do everything you can to help. The manager took another drink from the glass. Yes, you're right. I'm sorry, but I just don't believe David could do something like this. He and Dennis always got on so well. Okay, I understand that, said Alan. He had remained standing so far, but now he sat down. Perhaps it would look less formal. So tell me what happened that night, here in the restaurant. The difference of opinion was about their sister, Peterson replied. There was a sister? Alan wanted to say more, but Agnes flashed him a glance that said, "Shut up, you're ruining everything." He apologized for the interruption and gestured for Peterson to carry on. Yes, Dennis and David had a sister. The manager continued. She was called Mary Swinburne. He paused for a few seconds, reflecting on his cousin. She is such a lovely lady. She married when she was quite young, and I gather they were very happy together until her husband died suddenly. They didn't have any children. She is going to take this news very hard when she... He broke off when he noticed the chief inspector and Agnes staring at each other. What am I missing? Don't you know? Alan said, slowly. Know what? Peterson replied, but he quickly guessed it wasn't going to be good news when Agnes reached out and clasped her hands around his. Alan took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say this. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but Mary Swinburne was found murdered a few nights ago. She had been shot, the same as Dennis. No, not Mary, too. Peterson wailed. I don't believe this is happening. He gulped down the remaining brandy in his glass. Alan allowed the news to sink in before speaking again. I'm sorry for your loss, but I have to ask how you hadn't heard about her death. Peterson took a deep breath and handed his glass to Agnes. Another, and please, just help yourself. He looked back at Alan. I've been away for a few days. I was at some damn newfangled conference for restaurant managers and owners. There was to be no contact with the outside world. The idea was that we concentrate solely on the course. He shrugged. Learn how to lure customers into our restaurants and keep them coming back. That sort of thing. It was all supposed to help with the business. He paused. I shouldn't have gone. I should have been here. A few days. Alan prompted. It was rubbish. Utter rubbish, Peterson ranted. I don't know why I signed up. I learned nothing new. For a start, they told me that, as the owner of the restaurant, I should not take any nonsense from my staff. I already knew that. He closed his eyes. I'm sorry, I'm just so shocked. It was a 3-day course held in London. I got back from the last workshop at about lunchtime today only to be informed by my head chef I needed to be here to take in a delivery this afternoon. He shook his head. I know. I'm stupid. Isn't that what the course was all about? Perhaps it wasn't rubbish after all. Maybe I am too soft. What the hell do I have staff for? They should have been here today for the delivery. I really need to sort them out. Yes, you do. Alan agreed. But that's not what this is about. We are talking about your 2 cousins, both of whom have been found murdered. Both were shot. At this moment, our pathologist is looking at the possibility that they were shot with the same gun. Now, think about this before you speak. Is there anyone out there who can verify you were where you said you were over the last few days? Agnes took a sip from her glass of brandy. Okay, she was feeling a little squiffy. She had topped up her glass when she did a refill for Mr. Peterson. Yet, she wasn't so far gone that she couldn't see the interview with the restaurant manager wasn't going well. She set her glass down on the table nearest to her and suggested she and Alan have a word in private. Nothing important, she said as she stood up and moved out of her shot. What the hell are you doing? Alan said when he caught up with Agnes. This guy is a prime suspect. No, he isn't. Agnes retorted. You saw how shocked he was when you told him the news about his cousins. But then I noticed a look of fear sweep across his face. That could all have been an act. I still need to verify his alibi. Alan sighed. Alan, you still don't see what I'm getting at. Mr. Peterson's 2 cousins have been murdered. He might be thinking that he could be next. But why would he be next? What were his cousins mixed up in? That is what we have to find out. Alan quizzed. But before he could add anything further, Agnes had already turned away and was walking back towards Mr. Peterson. Can you tell us what Mary had done to cause her brothers to argue? Agnes asked as she sat down beside the restaurant manager. But then another thought crossed her mind. The police were informed that the man who was arguing with Dennis had been sitting at another table. Didn't you think it strange that They weren't dining at the same table. She glanced at Alan. I mean, being brothers and all, anyone would have thought. I know what you mean, Mr. Peterson interrupted. He gulped down the remaining brandy and slowly lowered the empty glass onto the table. Dennis and David were great brothers, he continued, always fooling around and having fun together. I used to join them, but somehow I got on better with Dennis. We seemed to be on the same wavelength. Gordon Peterson fell silent. For a moment, as he reflected on the past, David was always the leader. Dennis and I, he paused. Well, I suppose we sort of fell in with whatever he suggested. He looked up quickly. Don't get me wrong. David was great. We both admired him and were quite happy to follow his lead. There was never any animosity between us. But then Mary came on the scene. Tears welled in Gordon's eyes and he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. I'm sorry, this is all getting too much for me, he said as he wiped the tears from his eyes. Mary was the only girl to be born into the family, he continued. She was lovely and everyone made a big fuss over her. I suppose she was spoiled, really. In other words, she got everything she wanted. Nevertheless, I have to admit that her brothers and I thought the world of her. But then we grew up. Dennis had always wanted to join the Air Force, but he was turned down due to health reasons. Peterson shook his head. It turned out that he had a heart problem no one knew about. It wasn't something really life-threatening, but he was told he would never be allowed to fly. Dennis didn't want a desk job, not in the Air Force anyway. Gordon broke off and wiped his eyes again. I still can't believe they are gone, he said. Anyway, Dennis gave up his dream and went into the insurance business. A bit of a come-down, but I think he did well over the years. Mary was personal assistant to the chairman of a large company in Newcastle until she was married. She and her husband moved to Yorkshire. She continued to live there after Peter died. However, she often returned to Newcastle to catch up with her old friends. I know she liked to stay at the Millennium Hotel. What about David? Alan asked. He was keen to learn something about him. Is he in the insurance business, too? Peterson burst out laughing. David, in business of any kind, is a no-no. He looked around, making sure no one had entered the restaurant while they had been talking. This must go no further. If anything happens to David because of what I tell you, I will hold you both responsible. Is that clear? He looked at both Agnes and Alan in turn. When they both assured him that they would not repeat a word, he continued. As a kid, David always admired the character James Bond. He read the books and saw all the films several times. Suddenly, one day he told his parents he wanted to be a spy. Naturally, we all laughed at him. His parents thought it was a phase he was going through and would grow out of it. They wanted him to get a normal job, find a lovely wife, settle down and have children. You know, the usual things people do. But David stuck to his guns, so to speak. One day, on impulse, he went to see his MP and, after a few meetings with various people, somehow or another, David got his way. He paused. I don't know where it came from. No one in any of our family was into codes, electronics, or anything like that. Yet David was really good at that sort of thing. He could pick locks, hack into computers, all sorts of things. Perhaps that's why they decided to give him a chance. So, David Drummond is a member of Her Majesty's Secret Service? Alan looked at Agnes in amazement. Had they really got this man so wrong? Yes, didn't I just say that? Peterson frowned, though I doubt he is working on a case at the moment. I understand he was here to catch up with Dennis, Mary, and me. Mary had written to tell him she would be in Newcastle this week. Mr. Peterson, Agnes held up her glass. Your news has come as a great surprise to me. Would you mind if I have another glass of your excellent brandy? A small one. Help yourself. Peterson gestured towards the bar. What about you, Chief Inspector? Though Alan would have loved a drink at that very moment, he declined. He really needed to keep his wits about him. There were so many things to think about. Could David be here on a case despite him telling his relatives it was a holiday? If so, could the case David was working on be linked to the stolen jewelry at the hotel? Come to think of it, did he check in before or after the first theft? But surely, the Secret Service wouldn't send one of their men to the hotel because the chief constable was concerned about Mrs. Hargreaves' missing necklace. No, the presence of an MI5 agent at the hotel would have to be for something much bigger than that. Was it possible he was here because of the latest theft? If he was right, and the necklace the Andersons claimed to have been stolen from them was actually the one stolen in London, then there was no doubt that the government would do everything possible to get it back. That would even include using members of the Secret Service. Alan glanced back at the restaurant manager. Did he really believe David was here on holiday in Newcastle? Or could he be just saying that? Though, if David Drummond was a good agent, he would be able to fool them all. By now, Agnes had poured herself another drink and was back sitting in her chair. Alan was surprised she hadn't said anything. Despite what he said, she always chipped in when she felt there was something missing, or something she disagreed with. Like earlier, when they were almost playing good cop, bad cop. I need to get back to the station, Alan suddenly announced. He felt he needed to talk this whole thing over with his sergeant. Can I drop you off somewhere, Agnes? Yes, please. Agnes said. Would you be so kind as to drop me off at my hotel? She swiftly finished her brandy and turned to Peterson. I really am sorry for your loss. It's unbelievable that you should lose two close relatives in such a short time. No doubt David will be in touch once he knows you are back in the city. A sudden thought crossed her mind and she shot a glance at Alan, but decided to wait until they were alone before saying anything. They were both seated in the car before either of them said a word. It was Alan who spoke first. I have got to have a word with David Drummond. Yes, I agree you need to find out what is going on with Drummond, Agnes replied. You do? Alan was rather surprised. So far, she had rarely agreed with him on any matter pertaining to the case. Yes, but I don't think you should speak to David. I think it should be me. She saw he was about to interrupt, so she quickly continued. Think about it, Alan. If he is up here on a case, then he is working undercover. Your face is well known at the hotel now. If anyone saw you talking to him, his cover could be blown. Your face is known at the hotel, too. Yes, but I am a guest, not a member of the police force. Anyone who sees Drummond with me, they might think I am flirting with the guy. Alan realized what she was saying made sense, but he was concerned about her getting even more involved. Surely a plainclothed woman police officer could do the same thing. No, it wouldn't be the same thing at all. As you said, I am known at the hotel. People recognize me now. The lift attendant, room service, and reception all know me. Is your officer going to walk into the hotel alone one evening and have a meal on the off chance David is there? What if he isn't? Will she keep trying until the hotel staff becomes suspicious at seeing a woman calling in for dinner every night? Agnes giggled. They might think she is a lady of the night? Come on, Alan, you know I'm right. Alan did know she was right, but he was still not happy with what she was suggesting. He sighed heavily. Okay, he said, somewhat reluctantly. Great. Now I have something else to run past you. Alan pulled the car over to the side of the road and switched off the engine. What do you want to do now? Nothing, I promise. Agnes grinned. I simply had a thought when I was talking to Mr. Peterson. What if? Alan groaned. Not again. What if? Agnes repeated, ignoring Alan's remark. Dennis and Mary were shot at the same time. Their bodies could have been stuffed into a car or van to be taken down to the quayside and dumped in the river. But for some reason, the van doors swung open and Mary's body fell out onto the pavement. Alan finished her sentence. You could be right. The pathologist at the crime scene stated that the body, who we now know to be Dennis Drummond, had been in the river for a few days. It could have been the same night we found Mary's body outside Bessie Surtees' house. The killers might even have stopped the van around the corner and returned to pick up the body. Agnes picked up the story, but they were too late. They found us standing over the victim, so crept back to the van and continued on their way, hoping the police would never find Dennis and link the two together. Agnes, I could kiss you. Alan blurted out the words before he could stop himself. He stared through the windscreen of the car, desperately trying to think of something else to say to fill the silence that followed. Now, don't you think I ought to get back to the hotel and try to figure out a way of bumping into David Drummond? Agnes changed the subject. That was the second time Alan had said that he could kiss her. Did he really mean it? Or was it more a figure of speech? Something he had heard on TV? Yes, you're right. Relieved Agnes hadn't questioned him about his remark, Alan restarted the car and set off towards the Millennium Hotel. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 19. During the short drive back to the hotel, Agnes outlined her plan to meet up with David Drummond that evening. She explained that she would dine alone in the hotel restaurant. It was the most likely place to accidentally bump into him. Failing that, she might find him in the drawing room or even the bar. Rest assured, Alan, if he is spending some time in the hotel this evening, I will catch up with him, she said as she stepped out of the car. There was no doubt in Alan's mind that she would. The only good thing about this arrangement was that she was meeting him in a hotel full of people. Nevertheless, he still couldn't help feeling uneasy about the whole thing. Remember, don't hesitate to call me if you feel upset about anything, he replied. She nodded before she turned and hurried into the hotel. Upstairs in her room, Agnes pulled several fashionable dresses out of the wardrobe and threw them onto the bed. She loved them all, but this evening was different. Though she hated to admit it, she was a lady looking to get together with a man younger than herself, much younger than herself. Not that she was looking for anything other than to talk. Nevertheless, she would still need to wear something stunning to attract David's attention. She sat on the bed, slowly sorting through the clothes. But then she stood up. Quickly. What the hell was wrong with her? David had been trying to bump into her for the last few days. She didn't need to do or wear anything special to catch his attention. She could be wearing moth-eaten old rags, yet the moment he saw her sitting alone, the chances were he would grab the opportunity to join her. Nevertheless, she still chose to wear a rather revealing, low-cut lace dress. The shade of blue rather suited her. Besides, if the gray hair was starting to take a hold, the dress wouldn't really be suitable. Or was she being too pessimistic? Alan wouldn't approve, but what the hell? Jim always recited an old saying, if you want to win a fight, you have got to give them something first. She closed her eyes for a moment as she thought about Jim. If he had been looking down on her this afternoon, what would he have thought if Alan had actually leant across the car and kissed her? Or more to the point, what would he have thought if she had simply told Alan to go ahead and do it? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the police station, Alan found his sergeant on the phone. I was just about to ring you, sir. Forensics has been on the phone. They have found a match between the blood taken from the pavement in Granger Street and that of the victim we pulled from the river earlier today. They're going to send the paperwork, but they know how urgent this case is, therefore they rang to bring us up to speed. Alan slowly lowered himself into his chair. He needed time to think. If Dennis and Mary were together the night they were killed, as Agnes had surmised, why wasn't Mary's blood found on the pavement, too? Was it possible that they had been out together for the evening before the murderer caught up with them? Perhaps the plan was to get them both into the van, drive off and kill them somewhere else, somewhere more secluded. But maybe the brother and sister had started to call out for help, leading the killer to panic and shoot Dennis on the spot and bundle his body into the van. Mary could have been in a state of shock at seeing her brother shot dead in front of her, making it easy to haul her in after him. Sir, Sergeant Andrews interrupted his thoughts. Did you hear what I said? The blood was up. Alan looked up. Yes, I heard you. Sorry, I was just thinking through something Mrs. Lockwood said today. Is it something you would like to share with me? Andrews' tone indicated he was being left out of the investigation. Alan coughed. Yes, of course, Michael. It wasn't very often that he called his sergeant by his Christian name, but it seemed appropriate right now. I was simply trying to get it sorted out in my head first. He went on to tell Andrews what he had learned from the restaurant manager about the two brothers and their sister. Finally, he came to the part where Agnes had come up with the suggestion that Dennis and Mary might have been killed at the same time. Like Mrs. Lockwood said, the murderer could have been on his way to dispose of the bodies in the river. But for some reason, the van door burst open, and Mary's body fell out. After all, the pathologist at the scene did say he thought the body we fished out of the river had been there for a few days. Andrews pondered on what he had been told. He would have loved to have been in the position to tell the chief inspector that the whole idea was rubbish. But he didn't have anything better to offer. Besides, it all sounded feasible. The van door might not have been closed properly, and the driver, in his haste to get the bodies out of the van, could have taken the corner too fast. After a long pause, Andrews cleared his throat. Yes, I agree. Mrs. Lockwood could be right. But I think there had to be at least two people involved. One person could not have lifted the dead body into the van by himself. There had to be another person there, especially as there would have been 2 bodies to throw into the river. Okay, we are clear on that, said Alan, thankful there wasn't going to be a skirmish with his sergeant. But is the murder of these 2 people linked to the thefts at the hotel and, he paused, where the hell does an MI5 agent come into all this? Do you want me to go to the hotel and speak to David Drummond? Bye. Now Andrews was already on his feet. The chief inspector closed his eyes. How on earth was he going to explain to his sergeant that Agnes was already on the case? Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 20. Agnes went downstairs intending to do everything possible to accidentally bump into David Drummond. Quite a change from her normal pattern until now. She had tried to avoid him. She hoped he was having dinner in the hotel this evening. It would make it much easier to meet up with him and have a chat. Nevertheless, even if he were merely to pass through the reception on his way out of the building, he would suddenly find her somewhere in his path. There was no way he was going miss her. Stepping out of the lift, she made her way over to the bar. For a moment, it had unnerved her to find Larry, the usual lift attendant, wasn't on duty. Since the episode with Drummond a few nights ago, they had become quite friendly. He had told her his name the following day when they were in the lift together, and now she looked forward to his pleasant chatter. However, she learned he would be back on duty at 7. It was good to know he would be around if her meeting with David didn't go well. She was surprised to find the bar almost empty. Where was everyone? Most people stopped off for a drink in here before dinner, most especially if they were staying in the hotel for a meal. It meant they didn't have to worry about driving under the influence of alcohol. Agnes ordered a drink at the bar and sat down at one of the many empty tables and waited for it to be brought across to her. She had only asked for a tonic water with ice and lemon, as she wanted to keep a clear head if David was to show up. Alan had given her clear instructions when he dropped her off. Do not leave the hotel with this man. On no account go to his room. Be sure to stay in public rooms where you're in sight of other guests at all times. We need to be sure he is who he says he is. If you're in any doubt at all, call me immediately. He had even insisted that she add his number to the speed dial on her phone. You can't be too careful, he had said. The waiter brought her drink and set it down on the table. He smiled as he handed her the bill to sign. Back at the bar, it would be added to her hotel account. You don't seem to be very busy this evening, she said once she had signed the paperwork. He looked fairly young and had a pleasant smile. He was dressed in the bar staff uniform, made up of a white shirt and black trousers. He was definitely foreign. Egyptian, she thought, very likely making his way around the world, learning various jobs in the catering trade. No, he glanced back towards the bar to make sure no one was watching him. Quite a number of people have checked out, and a few reservations were canceled after the word got around about the thefts. Really? Agnes was genuinely surprised. She hadn't realized that the word had got out yet. She had seen no mention of it on television. But, on reflection, when had she been in her room long enough to watch the television news? She had been out most days and evenings, come to that. In between, she had been in the process of getting ready to go out somewhere or other. He glanced towards the bar again. She followed his gaze, half expecting to see some ogre of a bar manager glaring at him for wasting time. But no one seemed to be taking any notice. Why would they? They weren't exactly rushed off their feet. So why was he so concerned? There are lots of people working here who are very anxious about their jobs. He looked around the room again, and when he saw no one was looking, he sat down. Do you have any idea who the thief might be? Me? Agnes was most surprised. You are asking me who the thief is? How would I know? The waiter shrugged. You seem to be very friendly with the policeman. I thought he might have told you something. He leaned forward in his chair. I would like to know what the police are doing about the thefts. Agnes was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable about this man's attitude. He was getting way beyond his station. But then she tried to relax. Like he said, he was probably worried about his job. Well, I am sorry to disappoint you, but I am afraid the police haven't told me anything I don't know already. That much was true. Come to think about it, most of what they knew was because she had told them, not the other way around. And what is it you know? The waiter asked. A grim expression crossed his face. The same as you, I imagine. Agnes replied. This man needed to work on His communication skills, she thought. Waiters were not supposed to interrogate guests in this manner. Was he fishing around for something? Or was he genuinely concerned about what the robberies were doing to the hotel's reputation? She heaved a sigh of relief when she saw two other guests walk into the bar and sit down at the other side of the room. "I think you have another customer, Ahmed," she said, making a note of the name pinned to his shirt. He glanced at the people and frowned. Agnes thought he looked angry that he had to move on. "Maybe we can speak later, just you and me." "Not if I can help it," Agnes thought, as she watched him walk across the bar. What was that all about? Was he genuinely trying to find out information from her because he was worried about his job? Or was there another reason? Something more sinister? It was hard to tell. Foreigners, still learning a new language, sometimes sounded aggressive when they were trying to translate sentences in their head. She recalled the very same thing had happened to her when she and Jim were abroad. One occasion in particular sprang to mind. She had thought she was asking politely for something in one of the gift shops, while really she was almost demanding that the shopkeeper gave it to her free of charge. It had taken another customer who spoke both languages fluently to calm the man down and stop him from raising the alarm. If it hadn't been for that lady, she and Jim might have missed their flight home while she was languishing in a foreign jail, awaiting trial. Since then, she had always tried to give everyone learning a new language the benefit of the doubt. Agnes was still mulling these thoughts around in her head when she saw David Drummond emerge from the lift. She had purposely placed herself in a position in the bar where she could see not only people stepping out of the lift, but also those who were entering the hotel. The latter was due to one of the mirrors adorning the walls of the hotel. The location of this one gave an excellent view of the double doors at the entrance. She recalled how when she had first seen them, she had felt uncomfortable, but now she loved them. By placing herself in the right position, she could see the bar and the reception from various angles. Not wanting Mr. Drummond to see she was looking at him, she turned away and began to fumble with her handbag, making sure that a few things fell to the floor. She then went on to make a drama of picking everything up, hoping to attract his attention. She may not want him to see her peering at him, but she certainly wanted him to notice her. It worked. The next thing she heard was his voice asking if he could be of assistance. "Thank you," Agnes replied. She gave him one of her most winning smiles. "I was simply looking for a handkerchief when everything seemed to fall out onto the floor." "I think that's it," Drummond said, placing everything onto the table. "I can't see anything else. I always thought that women's handbags were a bottomless pit, rather like the one Mary Poppins had." Agnes noticed that his eyes lingered on her mobile phone for longer than necessary. She laughed as she placed her belongings back into her bag. "Yes, they are. The problem is, when we go out for the evening, we tend to change to a much smaller handbag, yet want to carry the same number of things, whether we will need them or not." Drummond looked around and seeing there were so few in the bar, he asked if he might join her. "Yes, please do." Agnes gestured towards the seat opposite her. However, he chose to sit in the chair nearest to her. For a moment she was caught unawares. Facing him across the table was one thing, but having him sit right next to her was something else. What if he was a double agent? What if he had been waiting for this very moment over the last few days and suddenly pulled a gun with an enormous silencer and shot her dead? It was possible. These things happened all the time in James Bond films. Agnes swallowed hard. She needed to get a grip. It was she who had volunteered to do this. Alan had wanted to send in an undercover policewoman to speak to Drummond, but she had talked him out of it. Now she needed to pull herself together and get on with finding out why he was here and, more importantly, why he was fixating on her. By the time Agnes agreed to him taking the seat next to her, he was already seated. He gestured towards the waiter and ordered himself a drink. "And you?" he said, pointing at her glass. "Would you like a refill?" "Yes, please," she said, glancing at Drummond. But when she was sure he was looking the other way, she held her finger and thumb close together, indicating to Ahmed that she wanted a small one. "Are you enjoying your stay in Newcastle?" Drummond said, once the waiter had returned to the bar. "By the way, my name is Drummond, David." "Drummond?" He held out his hand. "Hello, David," she replied, trying desperately not to laugh at how he had introduced himself. Did this guy really see himself as James Bond? "I hope you don't mind me calling you," she coughed. "David." She hoped he hadn't. noticed her slight hesitation. She had been on the brink of calling him James. I'm Agnes Lockwood, but please, call me Agnes. Yes, I am enjoying my visit. She explained how she had been born here in the Northeast, but had left the area many years ago. Now I'm simply trying to catch up with my past. She smiled at the waiter, who had suddenly returned with their drinks. Thank you, she said, graciously, as he placed a glass in front of her. His interruption had broken David's train of thought, allowing Agnes the chance to turn the subject around. Cheers, she said, raising her glass. And you, David? Agnes questioned. Are you here on holiday? She took a drink from her glass of gin and tonic and almost choked. Hadn't she made it clear she wanted a small measure? Cheers, David answered, picking up his double whiskey. I came to visit my family. He took a large swig from the glass and then swallowed another. Before he continued, like you, I came here to catch up with the past. He held up his hand to attract the waiter's attention. He pointed at his glass. Another. What about you? He added, nodding towards Agnes's glass. I'm fine, she replied, placing the palm of her hand over her glass. And have you? Agnes prompted. Caught up with your past? David eyed Agnes thoughtfully. He had spent the last few days trying to catch up with this woman. She had an image of him on her phone and he needed to remove it. Now he had finally caught up with her. All they were talking about was catching up with their past. He picked up the remainder of his whiskey and swirled it around in the glass. I think in my case, my past caught up with me, he said. Before he could say anything further, Ahmed placed a glass in front of him. David signed the bill with a flourish and then turned back to Agnes. Haven't we met before? Agnes took a sip of her gin and tonic to give her time to think about how to answer. If she was correct in that he had mistaken her for the woman who had taken his photo a few nights ago, then that needed to come from him. I believe we bumped into each other in the lift the other night, she said at last. But I don't think we spoke. I recall the lift attendant did all of the talking. Yes, he did rather, didn't he? David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going well. Either she had no idea what she was talking about or she was a damn good actress. But I wasn't referring to when we were in the lift together, David continued. I recall seeing you a few evenings earlier. It was near Granger Street, and it was rather late. No, I don't think so, Agnes replied, slowly. She shook her head. You see, I haven't been in the city center late at night. I have had a few evenings out with an old friend from my past, but we ate in restaurants here on the quayside. Although she could see David was puzzled, she wasn't about to help him out. She was here to learn a few things from him. This whole meeting was meant to be an exchange of information, though he didn't know it yet. You must be mistaken, she said. But I could have sworn I saw you, he blustered. You even took a photograph of me on your mobile phone. The last sentence was out before he could stop himself. Now I know you have made a mistake. Agnes picked up her handbag and removed her mobile phone. I don't have any photographs of you. Take a look for yourself. She handed him her phone. Agnes watched David as he looked through the photos and videos. Thankfully, she had erased the video she had taken of him the day he followed her across the Millennium Bridge. Once it had been transferred to Alan's phone, she had deleted it in case there was ever a moment such as this. I don't know what to say. David handed the phone back to her. I can only apologize. I felt sure it was you I saw. Why is it so important, anyway? Agnes shrugged, trying to be flippant. I mean, what if I had taken a photo of you? Would it really have been such a big issue? No, I suppose not. David laughed, but Agnes could tell his laughter was forced. I thought we had met before, he continued. Obviously, I was wrong. It must have been someone else I saw that evening. Agnes watched him as she dropped the phone into her handbag. He seemed satisfied that she hadn't seen him hurrying up the road that night, but she could tell he was now concerned that there was some other person out there who had evidence which could place him near the scene of the crime. But this was not the time to dwell on that. She needed to gain his confidence if there was to be any chance of her learning something that might be useful to the police. She was wondering what to say next when he interrupted her thoughts. There have been a few thefts at the hotel, he said. Has any of your jewelry been taken? No, thank goodness, she replied. Ever since Mrs. Hargreaves reported her necklace stolen, I have carried my jewelry around with me. Not that I have Anything really valuable in a monetary sense, she added hastily. But what I have as precious to me as they were gifts from my late husband. I'm sorry for your loss. David muttered the usual MI5 comment for such news. It was over a year ago now, Agnes said quietly. But I am still trying to get used to him not being with me. We did everything together. Agnes cringed when David looked at his watch. Had she blown it? Was he looking for some means of escape? Are you dining here in the hotel this evening? David asked. If so, I thought we might have dinner together. Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful idea. Agnes was relieved. Dinner together was what she had been hoping for. People with secrets tended to loosen up over dinner. Fine wine and good food was well known for making people relaxed, especially fine wine. Things were often said over dinner that might otherwise have been left unsaid. I thought I was going to have to dine alone this evening, she said as she gathered her things. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 21. In the dining room, Agnes was careful not to carry on the conversation where they had left off. Though she would have been happy to talk about Jim, she was aware that she needed to keep David chatting, not send him to sleep. Instead, she talked about how she was enjoying her stay in Newcastle, telling him about her visits to both the art gallery and the Sage. Both were most interesting. I'm sure you would enjoy seeing them. Agnes noticed him flinch slightly when she mentioned her trip across the Millennium Bridge. That was the day he had followed her. Nevertheless, she carried on as though nothing had happened. What about you? Are you here on business or pleasure? She asked. Both, he replied. I live in London, so I jumped at the chance of doing some business here in the north, as it gave me the opportunity to meet up with my brother and sister. That's nice. I don't suppose you will get to see them very often. Her heart weakened apache. They were now moving towards the reason why she had met him that evening. How would he react? Would he simply agree with her and swing the conversation over to another subject? No, we didn't meet up enough, he said thoughtfully. And now I won't see them ever again. The words were out before he'd had time to think about what he was saying. Why is that? Are they moving abroad? Agnes asked the question even though she already knew the answers. By now her heart was pounding. Would he tell her the truth? Or would he make up some story about them moving halfway across the world to Australia or New Zealand? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. David studied Agnes from across the table. He wondered how to answer her question. The Home Office, already aware of his brother and sister's death, had warned him to stay silent on the issue. Therefore, he knew he should change the subject, move the conversation onto something else. Normally, he wouldn't find it a problem. Part of his training had been to learn how to turn a subject around without anyone noticing, and, over the years, he had done exactly that without a problem. Yet, he had the feeling this time his audience wouldn't be hanging on to his every word. Agnes Lockwood had been going out with the chief inspector. He had seen them together. No doubt the detective had discussed some aspects of the case with her, if not all, even if a man in his position wasn't supposed to. Agnes was probably a very persuasive woman. He took a deep breath. He knew that whatever he said next had to sound very convincing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Agnes sat quietly, slowly sipping her wine. She wondered what was going on in David's head when suddenly he slammed his hand down on the table, making her jump. The glasses and cutlery rattled so loudly, a few of the other diners looked around to see who was causing the disturbance. Sorry, he mumbled to Agnes. Sorry, David nodded towards the people at the tables closest to him. Agnes didn't say anything. Truthfully, she didn't know what to say. Not expecting such an outburst, she hadn't prepared herself for the sudden explosion from across the table. Maybe this hadn't been a good idea after all. A policewoman would have known what to do in such a situation. She raised her glass to her lips again and took a couple of sips of wine. The brief interval would give her the chance to think through what to say next. However, there was no need, as David took up the conversation. Both my brother and sister were murdered last week. He looked away, though trying to hide the tears in his eyes. And it was my fault. Though David merely mumbled those last few words, Agnes picked them up. She wanted to ask why he had come to that conclusion, but decided to wait until later. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand in sympathy. Oh my goodness, David, I am so very sorry. You must be devastated. Even though she knew in advance of David's loss, she had not been prepared for his display of grief. He looked absolutely devastated. Agnes swallowed hard. If it would help you to talk about it, then I am here. Agnes suddenly felt guilty at her attempt to be a shoulder to cry on. What would David Drummond think of her when he found out she had known the two murdered people were his siblings all the time, and she was here tonight on an errand to prize information from him to pass on to the police? It was almost certain he would find out. It was only a matter of time. She was already surprised his cousin hadn't been in touch to tell him about her visit, together with the chief inspector, to his restaurant that very afternoon. Alan had introduced her as Mrs. Lockwood, so the restaurant manager had her name. But even if Mr. Peterson had forgotten her name due to their stressful conversation, surely David would have guessed it was her. He wasn't an idiot. He was an undercover spy for the Secret Service, for goodness sake. She covered her mouth to hide a smile when a thought suddenly ran through her mind. This could almost be the day that James Bond took Miss Marple to dinner. Yet, even with that comical thought in mind, something troubled her. If David really was here in Newcastle in an official capacity for MI5, why would he be using his real name? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. When they had finished dinner, Agnes and David went back into the bar. Agnes was a little disappointed that he hadn't opened up further. The evening was drawing to a close and she still hadn't found out what he was working on, and why he felt the murder of his brother and sister was his fault. David had taken the opportunity to change the subject entirely when the waiter brought their meal to the table and had kept away from the issue of his family ever since. Instead, he had been more interested in hearing about her stay in Newcastle. She was going to have to try again over drinks in the bar otherwise. All this had been a complete waste of time. I have just had a thought. She waited for a few seconds, hoping he would think she was still running the idea through her mind. Is it possible that the murder of your brother and sister had anything to do with the thefts here at the hotel? Agnes sat waiting patiently for him to reply. She didn't take her eyes off him for 1 second, fearing it might give him the chance he was waiting for, to call the waiter or to wave to some non-existent person passing the bar doorway. Anything at all that might give him even half a chance to distract her from the question she had asked. From his glazed expression, she could tell he was thinking it all through. Yet, the very fact he was taking so long to reply told her the murders did have something to do with the thefts, regardless of which way he might respond at the end of his lengthy deliberation. Therefore, there would be a problem with whatever he said. If he were to say there was absolutely no connection at all, then she would have to go down the road of inquiring why he was so certain one had nothing to do with the other, hoping it would lead him into giving her some sort of explanation he'd had to make up on the spur of the moment, which would ultimately lead him into saying more than he wanted to say. Her eyes never left him as she reached for her glass and took a sip of her gin and tonic. It tasted good, so cold and refreshing. She had found it rather warm in the dining room, and it wasn't much cooler in here. She took another drink, a larger one this time, before setting her glass back on the table. David had still not uttered a word. Why didn't he say something? This was getting more complicated by the minute. Now, even she was beginning to lose the plot. Her head was starting to spin. Why was that? Had she had too much to drink? No. She had kept her hand over the glass when David had reached over to top up her wine glass. Could he have spiked her drink when she wasn't looking? No. Again, that wasn't possible. All through dinner, she had never taken her eyes off him. Yet, if this guy was as cunning as MI5 agents were supposed to be, then he could have waited for the right moment to add a few drops of something into her glass without her even knowing about it. Fearing such a thing might have happened, her mind raced through some of the James Bond movies she had seen. She needed to think, keep her mind occupied. The character in the films had used fountain pens and many other such gadgets devised by Q to drop something into the victim's drink to put them into some sort of a coma. However, in all cases, James Bond always had to lean close to his victim. Agnes tried to focus her mind on whether David had leaned over her glass during the evening, but she couldn't remember. She didn't think he had, but how near would anyone have to be to drop something into her drink? Her head was spinning faster now, and the voices of the other people in the bar sounded distorted. In that instant, she knew she was in trouble and needed to call Alan. But if David had spiked her drink, he wouldn't allow her to leave the table, even if she told him she was going to ladies' room. So instead she raised her arm and called for a passing waiter. It was Ahmed, the waiter she had spoken to earlier that evening. Please, I feel poorly, she gasped. I need someone to help me up to my room. A few minutes later, Agnes found herself stretched out on her bed in her hotel room. Two ladies from the reception area were kneeling beside her, while the hotel manager hovered in the background. Where's my phone? She called out. I don't think having your phone is a good idea, the manager replied. You need to stay calm. We'll call an ambulance. I don't want an ambulance. Just give me my damn phone, Agnes screamed. I need to have a friend here beside me. Okay. The manager nodded to one of his staff and she handed Agnes her handbag. Agnes didn't notice the manager and his staff leaving the room as she fumbled around and found her phone. She pressed the button on her speed dial, which would immediately connect her to Alan, and yelled down the phone the moment he answered. This was not the time for pleasantries. Alan, I am feeling so unwell. Help me. I think I have. But that was all she was allowed to say before someone yanked the phone from her hand. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 22. Alan had felt uneasy all evening. Truthfully, he had been uncomfortable from the very moment he had agreed to Agnes meeting up with David Drummond. Even more so since his sergeant had suggested they were playing a dangerous game. But as the evening had worn on, his discomfort had grown worse. He knew Andrews was unhappy at being left out when the decision had been made. His sergeant had made that very clear, even though he had agreed that the reasoning behind the decision was good, but it should have been one of the team, he'd insisted, not a member of the public. Andrews had gone on to suggest that Agnes could be out of her depth. Drummond could be a rogue agent, a double agent, working for and against the United Kingdom. Though Alan had played down such thoughts at the time, they were still mulling around in his head when he arrived home. What on earth had he been thinking to allow Agnes to meet up with this man? But since first seeing her, he seemed to have forgotten that he was a chief inspector in charge of a murder investigation. He should be the one taking control, yet he was allowing her to run rings around him. Of course, Andrews was right to be annoyed. He was a good sergeant and would be promoted to inspector when an opportunity arose. He had already passed the necessary exams. Alan knew that he would have been quite hurt if his previous chief inspector had cut him out of any investigation. He was going to have to make it up to Andrews. But right now, his attention needed to be focused on Agnes and her meeting with Drummond. It was at that very moment his phone began to ring. Flipping it open, he immediately saw that the caller was Agnes. He didn't have time for any pleasantries as her voice came down the line the moment they were connected. He was stunned. She was crying out for him to come to the hotel right away as she needed help. I think I have, she screamed. Then there was silence. Agnes, he yelled into the phone. There was no reply. He quickly phoned her back and tapped his fingers on the table impatiently while he waited for her to answer. But when it stopped ringing, it went to voicemail. Alan grabbed his car keys and headed out of the door and hurried towards his car, still parked in the drive. As he started the engine, he called Andrews. Get to the Millennium Hotel right away. Agnes is in trouble. Meet you there. Without another word, he threw the phone onto the passenger seat, lobbed the gear of the car into reverse, and backed out of the drive. Both Alan and Andrews arrived at the hotel at the same time. As they ran through the doors, Alan told his sergeant about Agnes's phone call. I don't know anymore. She was cut off in mid-sentence. The phone could have been snatched from her hand. Andrews nodded. He noted the look of anguish on the chief inspector's face. This was not the time to say, I told you so. Instead, he said, I called for backup once I was on my way. Good. We may need it. The two police officers entered the building and took the lift up to the 4th floor. The lift attendant was nowhere to be seen, so there was no need for small talk. As they moved nearer to Agnes's room, Alan pulled a gun from his pocket. It had still been locked in the glove compartment. He had forgotten to remove it when he had arrived home earlier that evening. But on the way to the hotel, he remembered it was there and thought it might be a handy thing to have around, just in case. Andrews raised his eyebrows when he saw it in Alan's hand. Don't ask, Alan said as he moved slowly towards Agnes's room. He shouldn't have a gun with him, though he did have a license to carry one. I won't, Andrews said, following his boss down the hall. Over the last few hours, he had seen a whole new side of Chief Inspector Johnson. Okay, stand to one side of the door, Alan whispered, raising his gun. When I knock and call out room service. Andrews stared at Alan with a blank expression on his face. Was this for real? Just do it. Alan hissed. Room service, Andrews called out as he knocked on the door. There was no reply. Alan lowered his gun and knocked on the door again, but there was still no reply. He tried the handle, yet the door remained closed. They needed a damn key card. Alan remained where he was, while Andrews went downstairs to the reception. A few minutes later, Andrews arrived back holding a key card. He pushed it into the lock and removed it. A brief nod from Alan told him to turn the handle and open the door. Alan hurled himself through the door only to find the room was empty. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 23. Agnes awoke with a splitting headache. It took her a few seconds to realize she wasn't in her hotel room. She sat up slowly and tried to look around, but she couldn't see much as it was so dark. There was only one small window high above her, and there was very little light coming from there. Where the hell was she? The last thing she remembered was being in the bar talking to David Drummond. What had happened in between then and now? But her head was still hurting so much, she was forced to lie back down and close her eyes. Slowly, she began to recall the events of the evening. She'd had dinner with David Drummond, and then she had agreed to go back to the bar for a drink to round off the evening. There were still many things she needed to learn from him, and that final drink in the bar might have helped. Her eyes snapped open. It was all coming back to her. It was while she and David had been in the bar that she began to feel unwell. Had he dropped something into her drink? But now, on reflection, why would he do that? According to Gordon Peterson, he was a government agent. Unless, of course, David wasn't really the man his cousin thought him to be. She groaned and closed her eyes when a searing pain ran through her head. However, as the pain subsided, she continued running things through her mind. Two ladies from reception had escorted her upstairs to her room. Even the manager had appeared when he heard the news. It was clear they all thought she'd had too much to drink, though she knew that wasn't the case. She had been very careful. She'd been determined to stay alert during her conversation with David Drummond. Her mobile phone had been placed in her hands when she demanded it, and all three had left the room while she was making the call to Alan. The next thing she remembered was someone snatching the phone from her before she fell unconscious. So where was she now? Surely she still had to be in the hotel somewhere. No one could have dragged her from her room into the lift and out through reception without being seen. Next question. Who had done this to her and why? Could it be David Drummond? Had she been right when she suspected it was he who had spiked her drink? Yet there was still something nagging at her. Something was telling her she was on the wrong track with Drummond. If only her head would stop pounding, she might remember more. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The two detectives hurried back downstairs. Alan was keen to speak to the staff on the reception desk. The two ladies were just about to go off duty, but were happy to help with the police inquiries. They explained how they had helped Agnes upstairs to her room. Didn't you think to call an ambulance? Alan asked. No. We simply thought she'd had too much to drink, one of them told him. Though, in light of what you say, we regret not doing that now. If we had, Mrs. Lockwood might have been taken to hospital and not have gone missing. You think? Alan muttered. Have either of you seen her since you came back downstairs? Alan's tone was brusque. The two receptionists looked at each other. They were really worried now. Had they missed something? Yet they had been here all evening. One of them would have seen her. No, she certainly hasn't come through the reception since we left her. It was the other lady speaking now. Unless she sneaked by and went back into the bar. I believe the young man she was with is still in there. The first receptionist added, trying to be helpful. What about your lift attendant? Alan suddenly remembered he hadn't been on duty when they arrived. He might have seen something. Larry was called away while we were upstairs, said one of the receptionists. I gather his mother had an accident. Alan looked at his sergeant. That sounded rather suspicious. However, he didn't get a chance to say anything further as the backup team arrived. Sergeant Andrews went over to speak to them. Did the young man in the bar escort you up to the room when you helped Mrs. Lockwood upstairs? Alan turned his attention back to the receptionists. No, the first lady looked at her colleague for confirmation. No, she repeated when her colleague shook her head. We are certain about that. However, Mr. Jenkins must have heard about what had happened from the bar staff because he arrived a few minutes after we got to her room. We all left when she used her phone to call someone. Alan asked them if they had seen anyone in the corridor when they were leaving, but they shook their heads and told him the corridor was empty. After thanking them both, Alan moved across to where Andrews was talking with the backup crew. Okay, I want you to spread out and check all the public rooms and store cupboards and talk to the staff, but do it discreetly. We won't get anywhere by jumping in and stamping our feet. But bear in mind, there have been several thefts at this hotel. One of the guests has been murdered and now another has gone missing. Be discreet, but thorough. Once the team had set off on their mission, Alan and Andrews went across to the bar. They needed to speak to David Drummond. They found him still sitting where Agnes had left him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. David Drummond hadn't moved from the bar since Agnes left. Earlier, one of the ladies from reception had called in to tell him that she and her colleague had taken Mrs. Lockwood up to her room, asking if Agnes would be all right. The receptionist had told him she was on the phone when they left. She also told him that Mr. Jenkins knew of the situation and he was sure that Mrs. Lockwood had simply had a little too much to drink. Since then, David had sat patiently in the bar sipping his drink. He had been expecting the police to arrive ever since he had heard that Agnes had started to make a phone call. He wasn't an idiot. He had known all the time that she was fishing around, looking for something to give her a clue as to what was going on. After he had seen her phone, he knew she wasn't the woman who had taken his photo a few evenings before. Yet he was certain she was aware of the person who had. His training with MI5 had taught him how to pick out the truth from everything he was told. Yes, she could have deleted the photo, but something told him she hadn't been the woman he'd seen that night when he was fleeing from the murder scene. He had been told to pack and head back to London when his boss had learned of the murder, but so far he had managed to hang on by ignoring their calls. Too much was at stake for him to leave now, and even if he did leave the area, he wouldn't be going to London. He had somewhere else in mind. He knew it wouldn't be long before MI5 picked up on this and sent 2 men to escort him back to London. Therefore, he needed to finish this as soon as possible and get out. David Drummond recognized Detective Chief Inspector Johnson when he slid into the seat opposite him. He had seen him several times while investigating the thefts at the hotel. "Can I help you guys?" David asked. "I hope so," said Alan. "I understand that you were having dinner with Mrs. Lockwood earlier this evening." "Yes," David replied. "She suddenly felt unwell, so 2 members of staff helped her upstairs." He paused for a moment and allowed a puzzled expression to cross his face. "She's okay, isn't she? I mean, she looked a little pale when she left, but I didn't think it was anything serious. She had been fine all during dinner." Alan looked up at his sergeant, though it might look like he was seeking advice from Andrews as to how far he should trust this man. The movement was to give him a moment or two to think. Drummond had sounded genuinely surprised at them asking about Agnes. Yet, he now knew this man was a trained agent. He had probably been taught how to conduct himself whatever occasion arose. He needed to find Agnes before she came to any harm. Therefore, though he was reluctant to do so, he was going to have to trust this man. "Mrs. Lockwood has gone missing," Alan said at last. "She called my mobile, saying she needed help, but then the call was disconnected. We got here as quickly as we could, but Mrs. Lockwood's room is empty. The staff on reception told us they haven't seen her since they helped her upstairs." He paused for one brief moment. "Is there anything you can tell us that would help find her before anything terrible happens?" Drummond opened his mouth to say something, but held back when he noticed a new waiter wiping a table nearby. Alan guessed Drummond was waiting for the waiter to finish before saying anything. In his job, he would need to be vigilant. However, the waiter lingered on, continuing to spray the table with some sort of antiseptic liquid and wipe away non-existent germs. Either that table was totally septic or the guy was trying to make a good impression with the bar manager. "I'm afraid I can't help you," Drummond said after a long pause. He spoke a little louder than he had done before, as though he wanted to make sure everyone in the bar heard every word. Once Agnes was hurried away to her room, I waited here hoping it was a simple problem and she would be back soon. At that point, the waiter took a step backwards and looked down at the gleaming table. Satisfied with his work, he moved across to where a couple of new customers had just sat down. Now that the over-elaborate waiter had moved on, David rose to his feet. "I'm sorry, I need to go now. I'm waiting for a phone call, which I need to take in my room." He was still speaking loudly. He smiled and shook hands with Alan. "I hope you find Agnes very soon." Then, as he turned to shake hands with Sergeant Andrews, he lowered his voice. "Meet me in my room in 10 minutes." He gave his room number before leaving the bar. The chief inspector and his sergeant sat down and looked at each other for a few seconds. Alan was the first to speak. "I'm not sure which way to take that man. At first I thought he was a little edgy because the waiter was too close. But then I wondered whether he was interested in how well the man was cleaning the table. Or could it be that he was buying time?" Andrews nodded. "Could be all three. Now he is buying even more time by leaving us here sitting here while he goes up to his room and makes sure there isn't anything incriminating lying around. Or maybe Drummond noticed something going on with the waiter earlier in the evening and was being cautious." Alan added slowly. "I don't buy it," said Andrews. "The waiter was simply doing his job. I was watching him the whole time Drummond was holding back. That waiter didn't even look in our direction. His attention was focused on cleaning the table." He paused. "Agent or not, I still don't trust David Drummond." The sergeant looked away. It was true. He didn't trust the man, though he had no real reason not to. Yet there was something that didn't sound right, and now the wretched man was moving in and taking over their case. So far, Agnes Lockwood had managed to worm her way into every aspect of the investigation. Now they had David Drummond butting his way in, and it seemed that his boss was simply accepting it without question. "I'm sorry, sir," Andrews said. "I just feel we are being taken for a ride by this so-called agent." "No need to be sorry, Michael. I understand how you feel." Alan smiled. "However, as detectives, we have to go with what information is thrown towards us." He paused. "We weed through any information thrown in our direction. Obviously, we find some of it to be stuff we already know to be totally useless. There are some things we will find will help, but only for a short time. Then, there are the odd scraps of info that will move us a step closer to the truth. Even one shred of information could lead us to someone who knows more than we do." Alan shrugged. "In our present case, that someone could be Drummond. He might have noticed something happening earlier this evening, something which could help with our investigation." By now, Alan was staring at Andrews. "So, tell me, do you really want to dismiss anything he has to offer because he is a so-called secret agent?" Andrews swallowed hard. He hadn't realized his envy of Drummond had been so obvious. "Okay, Sergeant. I think we have given Drummond enough time. We'd better head upstairs." He paused. "However, let me tell you something. I, too, am not convinced about this man. I suggest we listen to what he has to say and then make our own judgment." Out in the reception area, the detectives found the backup team hovering around. Their report wasn't good. No one had seen Mrs. Lockwood. Alan was told that a forensics guy was still in her hotel room looking for fingerprints. The chief inspector nodded, but he felt sure the men wouldn't find anything. He suspected that whoever had abducted Agnes would have taken great care not to leave a trace of his identity. After sending the men back to the police station, the chief inspector looked back into the bar. He wanted to make sure no one was watching them as he and Andrews went upstairs to talk to Drummond. He saw the two waiters standing at the bar with their backs towards the door. No doubt they were waiting for their orders to be fulfilled. As for the customers, they were so involved with the conversation going on around them, they wouldn't have noticed if a famous film star had walked into the room. Alan nodded to Andrews and they both quickly made their way across to the stairs.